everyone. How's it going? We've expanded our audience size exponentially here, and it's fantastic. So we have a massive toccata on the screen right now, too. Just massive notes. So what we've been doing, Monday we mostly covered the Middle Baroque. Today we are wrapping up Bach. We spent 2 hours on Bach yesterday and brought a lot of people up to attempt performances of some improvisatory forays on some of the Bach pieces we were looking at, some of the patterned Bach pieces in particular that we have looked at in this class. And I wanted to sort of close out Bach today and move on to Mozart at this point. So a few more things to say about Bach, and also some attempts at guidance if you are thinking of doing something with Bach for your final project. This whole series of workshops will have a cumulative effect between this last week and the last week of October. Then you will have this whole gigantic stylistic palette to try to figure out what to do with for your project. So, what is a toccata? What's the most famous toccata? Fun fact, there's a lot of skepticism as to whether Bach actually wrote that piece.
Yes.
Yes?
So a toccata, basically, as I understand it, is just kind of a piece that shows off how good you are. It literally just means touch in Italian.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ego piece. And the toccatas never died out as a genre. There are famous toccatas by Schumann. There's Prokofiev toccata that also starts like that. It's sort of a D minor thing as well. It's continued to exist. It comes from the Italian toccare, which means to touch, or a touch piece. So it's sterile in one sense. It's not proclaiming to have any particular emotional content to it. It's not necessarily claiming in its title to have any structural content to it. However, there are toccatas that are among the most sophisticated keyboard pieces ever written. It's not necessarily just fireworks. So there's virtuosity in these pieces, but there's also a lot of different idioms happening in them. So what we get from Bach's toccatas are a sense of how he improvised, of how we think he improvised at the keyboard. So Baroque pieces called toccatas have that property to them. We don't really, that improvisatory aspect in things like the Schumann toccata and the Prokofiev toccata and so forth, we don't really have that sense. It's much more sort of motorhythmic, like the beginning of the Prokofiev toccata. As I mentioned in previous classes, pieces called fantasies are also often a window into how we think composers improvise. In the last class, and a lot of you weren't here for that, I talked about a piece of Beethoven's called Fantasia, and it's the only solo piano piece that he bestowed with just that title and nothing else explaining. We have these sonatas, quasi una fantasia, which is actually what the Moonlight Sonata is subtitled. But there's a piece called Fantasia, Opus 77 for solo piano, and we have a sense of what Beethoven might have improvised like in this piece. I mentioned in that class that the first part of it goes through a lot of sections that seem like they might belong to a lot of different pieces and wild changes of keys. And then it ends with the theme and variations, which I mentioned in the last class too, that in the classical era and early romantic era, a lot of pianists use that as a format for improvisation. Here's a theme. How many different, completely contrasting variations can I just make up on the spot on this theme? Makes sense, right, for a format for variation. So, toccata. So that's what we have here. I wanted to look at a couple of harpsichord toccatas of Bach. This is a toccata in D minor. It's not the most famous toccata in D minor by any stretch. Play some of this for you, but give you an idea of what the different sections this goes through. Yeah, so we start off with this very rhapsodic stuff. We start off with music that we think is this kind of window into how Bach improvised. You could just see the way it looks on the page with these kinds of cascading lines and 30-second notes and so forth. It's meant to be played very rhapsodically, not unlike the Louis Couperin preludes. Rhapsodically, like I'm making it up on the spot. It's not a rhythmic piece so much. This cascading passage. We have a passage here in pedal point, which we talked about in the last class. It's often used in improvisation. Organists use it a lot, hence the name pedal point for organ pedal. So we have in this line, is a sort of an invitation to extend it and add other chords on top of it that don't. The chords are sort of wandering, trying to find the tonic eventually. So they're mostly found on tonic pedals or dominant pedals. That's where we find them most often. That's for you jazz people, we sometimes call them slash chords. In the classical side, we call it pedal point. And then we have, finally, it lands on the cadence. in toccata. To have a rhapsodic section, and then a very slow, expressive section, where we, in particular, use a lot of suspensions, which we talked about in the last class. Suspensions are marvelous expressive devices on a harmonic instrument. We retain a note or notes from the previous chord while we change chords, creates a dissonance, and then we land on eventually land on the correct note in the chord. And we talked about certain kinds of chords, certain kinds of suspensions have different kinds of affects, emotive value. So-called 9/8 suspension in minor, where the crunch of the 2 and the minor 3, creating that sort of painful dissonance, sort of a code for tragedy in music. I love what Bach, look at the first chord that he writes. In the slow section. The sustained is just so dissonant, it's so ambiguous. Right? So what is this chord? How would we label it?
Which chord, are you talking about the second measure and the top?
It's the third beat of the second measure.
Alright, well, if you were to take that out of context, you'd have a B flat major 7th third inversion.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to say that the A is supposed to resolve to G, then it's an unresolved G minor 7. Although,
But we don't actually have the G in the chord. So without the root. And this is what people argue about, or what theorists argue about.
Yeah,
You know,
you
to-
also
you-
got a little bit of the E half the major 7 kind of thing coming on the next beat.
But this is great. This is you're exactly illustrating the point that I'm starting to make. It's ambiguous enough so that there's more than one way to think about it. When we have 7th chords, in particular, third inversion, we can think of them as third inversion 7th chords, or we can think of them as slash chords, because we've got this triad on top, right? And that triad, since all the notes are together, has a powerful identity by itself. And the real dissonant quality of the chord there is at the bottom. That's the one that seems to be sort of aching to resolve. And it's that minor, that minor 9 suspension idea, in this case more of an appoggiatura that eventually resolves. Where does it go? Not really a resolution, because we're not resolving to a consonant chord, we're resolving or moving to another dissonant chord, after that. We're moving to a diminished triad. I love that moment in this piece, and I love that he starts with that chord. It's very audacious. Right, so we can think of it as B flat, and be a slash chord, B flat over an A pedal, too. A classic thing that people do with this chord. Is it a C major 6th chord, a C major 6th chord, or is it a C major, or is it an A minor 7th first inversion? Depends on where it goes, depends on how you hear it. So I'm going to play through this, and what he's doing is he's stacking suspensions and overlapping suspensions all over the place in this music. having dissonances in all of this. Major seventh chords, major ninth chords result from some of all this overlapping stuff that he's doing. You see all the ties. Pianists, I want to also let you know that despite the fact that you see ties in music of Bach and you see suspensions created this way, in Baroque performance practice, you always have license to restrike the suspension, to restrike the suspended note if you want to enjoy the dissonance. And so I was doing that a lot in this to exploit some of the stuff that was happening in this passage. So you see a lot of the seconds up at the top here. When we strike that one, so we hear D, E, and the F sharp together. Major ninth chord, and then down to the third measure. Stuff like that. So it sounds like a very, very foreign harmony that we don't, in the context of Baroque music, that we don't necessarily expect, but it's all legal because it's all, these stacked suspensions, they all sort of resolve correctly, but you can dwell on them. And we think that when this music was played, that Bach would dwell on these moments, that keyboardists would dwell on these moments because they're so expressive. So I've suggested to the pianist that when you're improvising in chord progression, one kind of improvisatory exercise in any chord progression is to, that's, basically triadic and seventh chord. So I'm obviously not talking about a chord progression that's lots of altered 13th chords. I'm talking about stuff more or less from the common practice era, is to see how many, just keep adding suspensions to, like every time you move to a new chord, suspend something from the previous chord, and then resolve it or don't resolve it, carry it into the next chord. So we worked on that exercise a little bit in the last class as well. So that's the opening of the Bach D minor toccata. And all these toccatas have a couple of fugues, so that's what happens next. So forth. Standard fugue opening and all of that. And then alternates, the slower sections come back, or a new slower section comes back, but generally they move in back and forth between these three kinds of idioms. Sort of fast, rhapsodic, improvisatory stuff, slow, very expressive music with lots of suspensions, and fugal passages. So just here's one more, C minor toccata of Bach. Which has a lot of rhapsodic, improvisatory stuff at the opening. the score on the screen here. So you heard all this rhapsodic stuff. Sometimes he stops at a cadence and gives us something much more rhythmic after these cascading scales. You see that fermata right there, and then he has seems to make more sense to play rhythmically. Then we'll have another cadence, and then we'll move on to some more completely rhapsodic stuff. So that's kind of a variety you can add to the playing. And here's that slow section, different from the other one, but again, he likes. A-flat major 7th chord with this sort of Lydian flavor. With the D natural there. To our ears, in a way. That's obviously not precisely the way you would have necessarily thought of it. But again, just a wonderful, marvelous use of suspensions here, taking the tonic, moving up a half step, the root up a half step, and then we're left with that major 7th chord. And here, he's creating something much more structured, a kind of counterpoint with this all over the place in this writing. He creates an inversion down here. And has it going upside down. So this is particularly hard stuff to improvise counterpoint, right? That's something I've worked on a lot. It's something that you can do. If you're doing it, I would suggest starting off with a kind of dialogue, just 2 lines, just bass line and a treble line, bass line and a melodic line. Not try to do 3 or 4 voices, right away. And just having a dialogue between the 2 hands. I don't know if anybody wants to try it.
Try exactly what, sorry?
Try exactly what? Well, just either taking something from this, maybe taking that line, or just something very short that's original. Let's try something. As I say, improvising counterpoint is really hard, or independent lines is really difficult. Let's not take that. Let's take something really, really simple. And besides, if we try to take that, the issue will be that you will unwittingly recreate something that's already in the music here. So we want to do something, I think, original in this case. So let's. Maybe something a little simpler like that, or even just something that's sort of easy to remember. Not something from this, but just the concept of improvising counterpoint, of improvising 2 lines at the same time. As he's improvising, there's the idea of improvisation. You could do that, yeah. Why don't you take something from, that's actually a good model, because you can take something that's only a line that we have here at this point. And so there's nothing that's suggested to you on the page. that's not, and that's something we haven't been in the class before, but I'm letting some of that slide as well. There is improvisation where you're trying to be completely pure, and this can happen in jazz too, right? I mean, where you would say, well, that's not a Bach harmony. That's more like a cool school harmony. So Charlie Parker wouldn't use that, or with some ridiculous purists, you know, here and there. It's really kind of a continuum how pure you want to be when you're improvising. And so in this class, we've done everything from trying to be idiomatic, but not worrying about, oh, that would be an illegal, oh, I played a parallel fifth, I've got to stop. Something like that, yeah. Versus take this as a departure point, the material in it is a departure point, and move into a stylistic realm that's completely on the other side of this. So I want you to try something different with this now. When you are practicing improvising counterpoint, we have talked about using too much pedal in here. Try not using any pedal. For one, since it is counterpoint and you've got linear motion in 2 lines. Stick with 2 lines, don't add a 3rd line at all, and try to have as much integrity, that way you can just concentrate on the 2 lines. And then just take 1 beat in this. Or something like that, and turn that into a motive, rather than going through the whole thing, just extract a motive from it, and maybe sequence it, but just stick with that as your kernel, as your DNA pattern for counterpoint. Jump right in and improvise a 3-voice fugue or something. But you're going into secondary dominant motion to go into new keys, and trying to keep both lines alive as I'm playing through that as an exercise. Only 2 lines, trying to be obsessive about the motive here. It's a really great improvisational exercise. Anybody else want to try it? Hurricane Ian?
She's new, shouldn't she?
Ah, okay. Oh, come on. We're also, everybody gets applause. You get free applause.
Yeah, free applause. It'll be fun.
And it's improvisation. The beauty of improvisation is that it's your improvisation, so there's no such thing as doing anything wrong.
Yeah. If you play a wrong note, the right note is only a half step away.
Yeah. That's the axiom that one jazz teacher told me. There's no such thing as a wrong note, or if you really feel like it's a wrong note, play it like you mean that wrong note, and then just slide to the right note, which is going to be a half step away.
Which jazz teacher wrote that?
It's a teacher I had at Peabody named Nina Sheldon. Jeff. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell me your name, please. Rachel. Great to meet you, Rachel. You can take anything from this. We were doing this. It could be that page. It could be any little thing from the first couple of lines. Just a few notes. You don't want to make it too complex because you want to be able to explore as much as possible from that motive. And then it's just a single line with the right hand and left hand, and try to have a dialogue. So you'll be places where what's hard to remember sometimes is to sustain notes in the right hand and move the left hand and go back and forth so that we're so used to the left hand moving slower than the right hand. And so we need to remind ourselves that the left hand has an equally important say in this. And just explore. Remember, there are no wrong notes. Use your ears, use your intuition. That's what we've been doing here. Improvise off of it with just 2 lines. Whatever looks good to you. This is your improvisation, not mine. Okay, great. I think that was getting more successful as you were going through it. Try not to have places where one of the hands is absent or one of the lines is completely absent. Don't lift. Once or twice you play 3 notes at the same time, so you want to stop yourself from doing that, and this is an exercise. And then shape the lines a little bit too. You were very sort of quiet and tentative, so breathe. Create contours and shapes dynamically, swells, and I think that I find that actually helps me keep the lines alive and keep them moving a little bit and create more of a sense of dialogue between the 2 hands as well. Great, thank you so much. All right, so it's definitely time to move on to Mozart. I will say that just for your information, this is not an assignment that you have to do. But one of the things I have in the Dropbox is a Baroque improvisation assignment that I have given all of my improv classes. And you can look through it, and I'm talking about in this assignment just different guidelines about how to put together a Baroque improvisation if you want to do a project like this. So sort of a checklist that I have here. If you're taking a work of Bach's and you want to add lots of stuff to it, improvise on it, you already talk about scale tones, passing tones, neighbor tones, talking about ornaments, talking about flourishes here, which we've talked about in the class, and shaping the line and everything. And again, you can go through all of this on your own. I think this was kind of a self-directed assignment. And just let me know if you have questions as we go through the course. Anything you see in the Dropbox as well. All right. Any questions before we leave Bach and go on to Mozart? Okay. So.
Can I ask a very quick question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and I'm just new here today. I'm also not a pianist, I'm a violinist.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
When you talk about suspensions and reattacking them, that we have that permission, to your knowledge, does the violinist have that permission to, when we see this, is that?
I think so. I mean,
Because
as
we
a
obsess
violinist.
about these markings as goings, and they really aren't for us
Right.
either, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think in the case of a string player, you have an advantage that we, on the harpsichord and the piano, don't have. And that is exactly, you're sustaining the note. The reason that I actually want to restrike the suspension is the note's decayed too much, and I can't really hear it. It's sort of only a suspension on paper, particularly on the harpsichord. And that's why restruck suspensions are often used in the harpsichord, because you're seeing this note that's sustained for 3 bars sometimes, and the thought is, well, this is kind of ridiculous. That's nobody's actually going to be able to hear that. But if you want to emphasize, so we'll hear the suspension no matter what. But if you want to emphasize it by just changing the bow at that point, there's no school of thought that I know of that says that that's illegal. So that's.
Well, and possibly the Baroque bow actually didn't sustain quite as well. So that's another argument to do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's thought that in with solo instruments that suspensions were sustained, they could be restruck ad libitum. So that's sort of the idea here. Okay, so let me find this score, which unfortunately is not in this file. And we find it this way. This works. I won't be able to uncover it. We get into the classical era. Okay. Go to IMSLP. Let's see, Endless Jeopardy. Okay. Well, we have the cheap Russian edition on IMSLP, unfortunately. All right. So we get to the classical era. What are some of the defining elements of the high classical era? How is Mozart different from Bach? This is an oversimplification, and Mozart is more and more influenced by Bach as we get closer and closer to the end of his career, and there are many more manifestations of chromaticism and dissonance in the writing. But so many eras are reactions against previous eras, right? So minimalism, just getting to the late 20th century, is a sort of reaction against extremely complex music that was being written by post-war European composers, as an example. So in the Baroque period, we have a lot of complexity, we have a lot of dissonance, we have a lot of chromaticism, we have a lot of counterpoint, as we've seen. And aesthetically, in the classical era, we have a kind of a simplification in the basic code of a lot of stuff that we find with Haydn and Mozart. This is a generalization that I'm making here. There are a lot of exceptions to this. And there's some very rich, very complex music that is influenced by the Baroque, that is influenced by avant-garde tendencies that Haydn and Mozart had as well. But the basic code, if we look at the opening of Mozart's concerto in C major K415, we see a couple of things happening. We actually do have imitation at the beginning of this, but we have these short articulated phrases and a real obstinate lack of chromaticism, of going outside of the key that lasts for a while, right? So look at all these measures. We do not have a single accidental for quite some time in this. So Mozart was one of the greatest keyboardists who ever lived, one of the greatest improvisers. We know he was a fantastic improvisational player. And where we find the greatest manifestations of his improvisatory language and style are in the cadenzas to his piano concerti, because they're supposed to be improvisations. They're supposed to be improvised. And we know that he improvised all of them. He didn't premeditate every single note and write something to try to make sound like an improvisation and then play it. So with some of his concerti, he meant them to be published and disseminated in his lifetime. That includes this concerto. There were 3 piano concerti that he wrote in a row, K413, K414, and K415, sort of the early middle period of his output. And he wrote in a letter to his father, Leopold, these are 3 of the best pieces I've ever written. And you know, I want to get them out there, or words to that effect. So these have published cadenzas in them. They were disseminated, they were meant for dissemination in his lifetime. So I wanted to go through this, just as we were doing with Baroque music, to start decoding what the classical style is, what the classical style is about, keyboardistically and otherwise. So it's good to look at, pianists and others, to look at the opening orchestra ritornello before the soloist plays, allegedly in all of this. Find the correct set list here. Too much music, that's the problem. And there it is. So we have this opening orchestral ritornello, and if we're entering a concerto competition, we never play it. We obviously, our accompanist is going to play that part first. It's probably going to be heavily cut because it's so long. But what did Mozart do when he played this? He played along with the orchestra. He played the opening orchestral ritornello with the orchestra. And I don't know why nobody does that anymore. When I played Mozart concerti, I haven't necessarily played every single note in the opening, but I've played along with the group.
Do you think maybe that's happened, like, let's say if you're not playing piano concerto, like if you're playing one of maybe Bach or Vivaldi's old violin concerti, if you go and play along with the orchestra, why you blended in so much, like with the same timbres as everybody else, it wouldn't sound much different if you dropped out or not. You might as well
I'm not aware of any performance practice for violinists to be playing along while playing, say, the first violin orchestra part in Baroque and classical violin concerto.
That's how I've seen it written down, though.
I mean, I'm saying I'm not aware of it one way or the other because it's not my field. Violinist help
Quite
with this?
often, I don't know if this is present time, but quite often violinists now will play the tutti in Mozart's concerto. But you're right, not as much in Baroque. I don't see that as much. But you are right also, that would blend in nicely, right? So, makes no difference.
Yeah, Ina?
Yeah, I also, not with Baroque, but with classical oboe concertos, oftentimes, I'm not sure what the accuracy is to purely performance practice, but I'm often in the part instructed to, have the first violin's part to play along with, and that might be less blended in, than.
Is that, and you're sure that's not a cue? You're actually, it's funny because the oboe would be in such, the timbre would be such a contrast. to
Yeah,
what's
and that's
happening
what I,
with the
so,
strings.
but I think kind of like with the piano, you can definitely tell if the piano's playing along, maybe that's, because I'm not given the orchestra oboe parts. But I'm also given other, it's just an addition, but I have big notes marked in for the violin part during tutti section, and I have other smaller notes as cues, so I don't think they're supposed to be cues, but that could also just be an editorial choice.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. It's not really, that's not an area I've explored because it's not, the performance, that kind of aspect of performance practice for non-keyboard instruments and concerti. It's fascinating that there might be something similar, but I think there's a really different reason and a really different historical reason why the keyboardist almost always played along at least in the classical era, not late classical era. Then it starts to die out more and more. It becomes more and more spotty, and that's because of the history of the keyboard being a continual instrument and sort of playing along with everything that was going on to begin with. And so adding a kind of rhythmic element with the sort of jangling of the harpsichord or the very definite attack of a forte piano, and giving it a kind of rhythmic definition that just because of the envelope of a string attack, it doesn't have. And so that's really the reason for that. But in today's practice, you don't really see that happening, very much at all, except with performers that are playing forte piano.
But it might also be because our modern piano sounds so different and it sticks out a lot more, maybe? Do you think?
I personally don't think that that's the case. A harpsichord is going to sound timbrally really different than the string ensemble. And that's actually the whole point of having that doubling going on. The piano is larger and can be more audacious, but generally when, as I say, I've only seen it done on forte pianos, although I've done it on modern pianos myself, but I play softer. I don't really play soloistically. I play as if I'm trying to blend with the group. But there's,
Does this have any relation to the occasional practice that I see of pianists I've noticed it a lot in romantic concertos, kind of where the orchestra tutti ends the concerto, the pianist plays along with the final motive and
the overlap, a little bit of overlap, you mean?
if for example Chopin 1, which ends with the scale,
yes.
And then sometimes occasionally I'll hear a piano, the soloist play with the orchestra, even though that's not written in the piano.
Right.
Or in the Mendelssohn playing the
Yes.
I'm just wondering if that's related to this or that's just.
It is related to it. It's a vestige. It's a vestige, and until we got to the realm of piano competitions, this idea that you only play what's in the solo part was never really a rule, to begin with. That you couldn't ever double or that there was any place where you shouldn't double what was going on. It's a, if it feels right, do it, you know, basically. But if you go to a competition, you're really not supposed to do that. You're only supposed to play what's officially in the keyboard part. And so that's an analog to what I was saying about competition sort of destroying the training of pianists and programs to improvise. But yeah, so it's an interesting history, and poses a lot of questions. But the point basically is, if you're ever playing a concerto anyway, not just by Mozart, but by anybody else, you really should be able to play the orchestra part, you know, everywhere as well. And you get ideas from that too in your, as far as possibly putting together your own cadenzas, because there's thematic material in the orchestra part that's sometimes never in the piano part, you know, as well. So I wanted to go through this piece in part to talk about the language and whatnot. So if we start off with this motive. There's quite a few Mozart piano concertos, and we're going to talk about formula a lot here, that start off da, 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 that start off with this rhythmic motive. So that's something that he recycles a lot. Technically, this is all imitation, but it's not staggered imitation. It's like harmonized imitation as new voices are coming in. Just happening at the exact same time. That's the opening section of this. There are so many sequences in this writing, and this is partly because the classical style is the vestiges of the Baroque era that we find in the classical style mostly comes from Italian Baroque music, or the so-called Italian style, where there's less prevalence of pure counterpoint and much more prevalence of melody and accompaniment textures and prevalence of sequences. We know that Vivaldi uses sequences to death, right? Long, long sequences in his writing. But improvising sequences is also a really great exercise and not among the most difficult improvisational exercises in existence. So we've got a sequence here in this third line. And when you see these sequences, it can be nice to continue them, you know, up the keyboard as an exercise when you see them in the writing. So that's a typical kind of opening. And I'll scroll a little bit here. And then this is the next section we have. Very sectional. In the classical style, another kind of difference, some difference compared with the sort of Baroque fugal thing of all these definite sections, articulated phrases, articulated sections that have beginning, middle, and ending, and then there's another 16-bar phrase that does something different and so forth. So, and this kind of propulsive 16th notey thing that he does, that it really comes out of the Italian style, happens next, and lots of suspensions. I'll just go that far. It's very much a kind of Mozart cliche. Right, so the strings is this sort of an extrapolation of repeated notes in strings or measured tremolos in strings. You have to look at the score to really know if if the viola's doing that or if the doing that, we don't know for sure. But just this kind of texture is, again, not one of the more difficult types of textures to improvise, measured tremolos. Suspension. There's a suspension there. Against that. It's a really actually interesting suspension because it's still resolving in a dissonance. It's a suspension only with that top voice, not with the wall, because that's part of it as well. So you kind of have, you could also call this, there's a pedal point going on, and a brief internal pedal, inverted pedal, that results down. Different ways to think of it. And then another sequence here. Here we have a major 9/8 suspension. This stuff is extrapolated into pop music very, very directly. And then we get to this cadence, and then he goes. So he brings back imitation here, and now it's a little bit more honest imitation. It's not the imitative passages are not right on top of each other. Essentially, just a harmonized version of what we had at the beginning with. It's not really imitation. So here he has an honest canon going on in the writing, which is nice. This is very important, and it will come back in the cadenza. So what I'm leading to this in all of this is showing you some of these idioms. I'm going to go through the beginning of the development section, and I'm going to make note of where some of these themes come back in the brief cadenza that Mozart included with this concerto. So he has this. You'll see that in the cadenza coming back, so take note of it. So that happens. That happens here in this passage. And then a big cadence on, big half cadence. And it gets something really interesting. And so forth. One thing that's a little bit unusual here is that we get to the dominant, and it just changes it to a minor chord. It goes into the parallel minor with no preparation whatsoever. That's a little bit audacious. That's the kind of thing that in the standard theory course you might get marked down for. There's a real counterpoint going on here with the two lines using the same material. This is, I think, maybe the most complex writing we've seen in the piece so far. And so he does this for a while. And it ends here. Gives us a short bit of material, sequences it, and then just moves to another short bit of material and just sequences that. And Then does it again, and does it again, and does it again. It's very much part of the language of the writing and something that works in improvisation in the classical style as well. And then this propulsive writing comes back, the tremolo motoric writing comes back here as the orchestra is wrapping up the ritornello section. And that's what we see happening next here. So he does something nice here just by putting that in the left hand, gives us a textural inversion. You know, we've done a little bit with inverting pedal point previously. Is that at this point? And some really very formulaic stuff happening. As much as a genius as Mozart was, I feel like sometimes he coasts a little bit. He phones it in. So, you know, stuff like is a little obvious, okay? And very easy to improvise in the whole sort of scope of what's easy to improvise and what's hard to improvise. That is really in the easy end of the spectrum. But this is a good example of, or I would say validation, of how I told you all it's okay to mix up your improvisations with things that are facile, are enjoyable. This is not sophisticated writing, but it's still really enjoyable, right? There's stuff that we all love that is not hard to do, not hard to understand, not hard to play, and we like it. And so it's okay to do that. And Mozart, if Mozart does it, we can do it, right? Again, this, what makes that cool is the suspensions again. Remember that you can resolve the suspension essentially and change the harmony at the same time. Right? So he's going. He's going and moving the roots, but it's still a consonance moving to a dissonance, or a dissonance moving to a consonance, right? It's the motto of the piece. And then finally the pianist comes in, but if you're like me, you've been playing along with the orchestra the whole time. So there's the first statement of the piano. It's very delicate, it's not virtuosic. It's very much in contrast to what happened in the orchestra part, especially at the end with this Mass Triumph. This is at least at first, a kind of delicate individual character coming across in the concerto. And then right after that, with the opening And here's what the piano does at this point. Right? So there's an invitation here, I think, to the orchestra is playing what it's playing if you want to. To add something in the left hand if you want to. You don't just have to sit there and play the trill. There are chart-like aspects to what we have in Mozart sometimes. Sometimes things are a bit stripped down, and we can absolutely add things because we know that he did, even from performance to performance. So let's see what happens next after all this delicate stuff. When I think about Mozart concerti, I think about characterization a lot. So I characterize the first impression of the soloist as maybe a delicate individual, because we're only in the high register of the keyboard and we're occupying this little space while we have this sort of massive triumphant music coming from the orchestra. There's a lot of metaphor in the idea of the concerto of an individual and society, or the individual and the masses, so to speak. And remember that Mozart was, I think, at heart an opera composer. And so with every one of his instrumental conceptions, I try to imagine different dimensions of the character, but different aspects of the character are revealed as we go through the concerto. So now we have a kind of outburst that happens next, and more concerto-type writing, more conventional classical era virtuosity that happens next. So after the cadence, does that on the piano. That's the entirety of the next passage. We start off with a sequence once again, right? And so forth. Scale going upwards. Going through a series of 5/1s, basically. Baseline doing this. It is not the most obvious of sequences, but it's also not the least obvious either. But I think very effective writing, these cascades going up. Get to deal with those skips going up to the chords over and over, so that's the most difficult part of it. And then you move from a sequence that lasts 4 beats, or 8 beats if you think of the pattern lasts 4 beats, 8 beats if we think of the constant cadential motion that's going between 2 measures at a time. And then we have a much shorter sequence that's rising here. It's very easy to play, fit under the hands really well. And then another example of really facile writing. This kind of writing. So again, kind of phoning it in a little bit. But again, there's something sort of something satisfying about this type of just to hear that and just to play it. It's nice to have a little bit of a break here and there. So very, we're most often have that kind of writing going up. There's a million examples of this kind of writing. It's just inverted, arpeggiated triads. Then we have the second theme, right? Because that's what's supposed to happen. The second theme's in a contrasting key, and usually starts off with more lyrical material, and that's exactly what he's doing here. Scroll to where that stuff with that 16th note action happens. So we have something very lyrical, square 4-bar phrases here, but very memorable and very lovely. And then a series of motorhythmic sequences for quite a while at this point. Go through some of this slowly as well as quickly. Stripping it down, that's really what's happening here. Very straightforward. Tenths, aka thirds. And then telescope is reined in, is compressed, and we turn the tenths into thirds. Then sequence. Take those passages and just keep the sequence going as an exercise. Very helpful as an improvisational exercise, particularly if you're going to take some of this material and try to improvise or compose or conceive in some way of a cadenza of these passages. And he's changing first the low note, then the high note. Classes, how that's really helpful. Not nearly as interesting if you went. Right? Much nicer. So that's what happens next. Yet another sequence. This time descending. Sequence after sequence after sequence. It's very much a part of the style. And then he ends with a lot of cascading scales. Once he gets to the end of that, textural inversion of the left hand and right hand. So textural inversion is a fantastic thing to use, a fantastic technique to use. It's very basic, very straightforward in improvisation to add variety. Just let the left hand do what the right hand did before, or vice versa. Right? So originally we had the right hand doing the 16th notes. And now we have this time he descends. And he has contour inversion now with this previous phrase. The hands are continuing to trade, to exchange roles in this place as well. Cascading scales moving about. That's a very typical kind of line. Basically just a scale in thirds that is arpeggiated. Is playing with the orchestra played at the end of the ritornello in the opening. With some surprises, some sort of incorrect cadences, you would expect. He doesn't do that, he goes. Sixth chord and cadences to the dominant instead, where we don't expect it. That happens right here. And then with these suspensions, we say, okay, maybe this time. It doesn't do it. Cadencing on the subdominant of the key, and then time for a little diminished seventh arpeggio, the most facile of all arpeggios, most ergonomic of all arpeggios, and then ends again with not the most sophisticated writing, compositional. Here, we do have a modicum of imitation, technically speaking, least sophisticated imitation to the left hand coming in here. But the right hand is really not doing anything, just playing a pedal on top of it for all intents and purposes. So that gives us the exposition of the piece, and a lot of the language and material in this piece and in Mozart piano concerti, in sort of Mozart in the prevalently in the early and middle periods of his career. When we look at the C minor concerto, we're going to see something very, very different going on, for sure. But I just want to take a moment of the opening of the development. After the orchestral transition here, this is what happens at the beginning of the development. Okay, so that's probably the most sophisticated writing compositionally in the piano part thus far. And in the development section, of course, we are supposed to have the most experimental writing, the least predictable writing, in a way, the least formulaic writing. And we did that here a little bit. Sequence again. To open it up, but a much more contrapuntal sequence. And just generally more sophisticated rhythmically between the two hands, more actually pure counterpoint going on until it gets to the cadence. This gives us all the material that's going to be informed in the cadenza, so I'm going to skip ahead to that. Here's the published cadenza. And what do we find in Mozart cadenzas? What are the basic building blocks? What are we doing? Well, on a very fundamental level, we are extracting themes that we've heard from the piece earlier and playing them in an unpredictable order. So that's sort of the first and clearest element that's going on here. So this is something, this opens with that contrapuntal theme in the ritornello, in the opening ritornello, that never appeared in the solo part. It's actually never appeared in the solo part in the piece. So that can be a nice thing to do to allow the soloist to play material that the soloist has not played before. So we get that as a opening. So we have it first. For cadenza to sound like a cadenza, there should be shifts from fast playing to slow playing in places that we don't expect them necessarily. There should be a sort of fragmented sense to the writing, to the playing of the cadenza, because that way it will sound more like an improvisation. If it's too structured, it won't so much. So this quick cadence after the manifestation of this section. Then we have little notes and a marking of adagio, little fermatas. And then this theme comes back. This is now theme 2 from the exposition. The soloist has played this before and introduced it as theme 2 in the first place, but now in C major, now in time. There's a lot of decoration written into the piece, so written into the cadenza before we extra stuff that he's written in, and just adding these chromatic elements, the ornamentation makes it sound more like an improvisatory cadenza. So when I'm playing something like this, I like to stretch some of those moments and exploit them a little bit so they don't sound premeditated, so it sounds more like I'm thinking of them on the spot. So if I was playing this cadenza, I would like to stop between the two measures where you heard me take a Luftpause, a comma, between here and here, because what happens in the original is something like that, standard cadence going 4-5-1, but instead instead of going there, it just goes to a different dominant 7. Not very audacious, but also by adding that extra measure, he's creating asymmetrical phrasing as well. He's sort of adding an extra measure to the phrase. In Mozart, we were so used to having 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, 12-bar phrases. When you add an extra bar and turn something into a 5-bar phrase, that's something that's going to make the music sound more improvisatory as well. And then he abandons it instead of cadencing on it. You could do something like that, but he doesn't. So he's now entering into some of the sequential writing we had later in the exposition. So we've heard a lot of this stuff before, but he compresses it and moves from one sequence to the other a lot faster than he did when he first introduced them. Yeah, he gives us one measure of this, one measure of the textual inversion of the sequence, moves right to the cascading, decorated scale intense going down, where he's just doing escape tones over and over on the offbeats. Otherwise, it's just a scale intense, right? Okay, then a little sequence here, a diminished seventh chord flourish. That's part of the formula. And then the most obvious ending imaginable. It's the last movement of the Moonlight Sonata, except in major. And sort of phones it in there at the end. It's okay to do that. That's great. And when you're at a little bit of a loss for inspiration, relying on something that is time-honored, idiomatic, enjoyable is great. And that can rejuice your brain to go forward. So, this is an example of Mozart writing in a major key, writing in the most Mozartian of styles, if you will, where he's not incorporating the kind of experimentation very much at all, the kind of levels of counterpoint and dissonance and unpredictability that we're going to find in the C minor concerto, which is the other big piece that we're going to look at primarily in the next class, because I would like to have somebody come up here and mess around with this a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the history, the convention, and the modern manifestations of improvising a cadenza in a Mozart concerto. Reminder too that improvisation and composition is not a binary, it's a continuum, right? So I have improvised cadenzas in Mozart concerti performance, but I will freely admit I have premeditated some of the elements of those. I don't just start, we get to the 1-6-4 chord, and my mind's totally blank and just something springs out, all of a sudden. Because I don't want to test that in performance. So I usually think of, I have a departure point, usually. In most of my improvised soloing, especially if I'm not playing with an ensemble, I like having the grounding of knowing how I'm going to start something. And knowing that, well, I might hate my whole improvisation. I might hate my cadenza. But I'm going to like the opening, because I like this thing I thought of to do with the opening. And it usually will help bring me somewhere. I've usually thought of basic sections, like I'm going to open this way, and then I'm going to move into this particular texture. And then I'm going to do a circle of fifths thing. And then I'm going to do a chromatic secondary dominant thing. Then we'll have a progression like something like that. But how far I go with it, where I stop, what patterns I use, I don't know. But it gives me some structure. I'm just giving you an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's usually 3 elements, sometimes 4. And I don't think of the ending. I never think of an ending. Except, what are you supposed to do at the end of a cadenza? Trill, baby, trill. Yeah. You end with a trill because, this is partly because the cadenza is supposed to be improvised. You need a signal. You need to be able to tell the conductor, if you're not conducting from the keyboard, which is what Mozart did, or tell the orchestra a signal about when you might be stopping. Right? And so that's what the trill does. And things got fancier and fancier, as you might know. You'll see some examples of this. This cadenza that Mozart composed, and for publication, just a very, very basic trill. But we also started layering trills on top of each other, having a long section, a long trill section at the end of cadenzas. And we'll look at some of those too, because that's a lot of fun also. So what do I do when I'm trying to think of things to do with a Mozart cadenza, and how do I practice improvising in this style? So often I'll take themes from the concerto. I'll try everything. I might try a theme and decide, this is not really doing anything for me. There's always another theme or another element just next door to it. Try that one, and then something might come to me inspirationally with that. So what I want to do is take, very opening with this. What's very user-friendly about that is you've got a repeated note aspect of it, dun, dun, da, dun, that's really easy to quote over and over, if you will. You don't have to worry about changing notes. And you've got a lot of possibilities of fragmentation. You've got really basic stuff. You don't have to manifest the whole theme when you're improvising on that theme. Ascending and descending. So that's something that's sort of basic. It's not a sort of complex thing where, what if I transpose it, I might have to use a different fingering over and over everywhere, right? You don't have to worry about that. You're just going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's sort of an example of me practicing ideas to use with that thematic material. Would somebody like to try this? Somebody who hasn't played yet. It doesn't have to be fast. Lovely thing about cadenzas. All right. Yeah.
Oh, wait.
No, go ahead. Sure.
Go for it. Okay.
So try showing us the whole theme now and then, but you can extract this. You can sequence your heart out, and then you've got a 5-finger pattern, right? One of the first things we ever learned. So we've got these 3 elements. You can sometimes go back and forth between any two of them. It's really relatively user-friendly phrase of melodic material and melodic potentialities.
Is it best to like kind of have like an outline in your head of like what sequences you're gonna do, or do you just kind of go into it making up sequences as you go?
Well, when I first will take something like this, I like to challenge myself by not premeditating anything. And then I'll try to come in with more discipline after that, because sometimes I really surprise myself. I'll come up with things that I did not expect. So that's something I would really espouse to when you're first improvising on some material. Try it without any preconceptions. Then add some preconceptions. But I think it's playing it too safe if you have too much premeditation, going into it. And don't worry about wrong notes, so to speak. Obviously with Mozart, you want to try to stay in the realm of tonality, but think about transposing, think about going through different keys. Remember, the circle of fifths is your friend. While you're playing in one key, just think of a key that's either a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth away before you move to that key, then move to it. So you want to always think about where you're going to go. You've got to think about it in advance. But you can stay in one key as long as you like. That's the great thing about doing this. You don't have to move in any prescribed way. It being a cadenza, we don't have to have long sequences like we do in the composed part, where we're going to move to a new key every 2 beats or every 4 beats, and we're going to do that for 8 measures. That will sound less like an improvisation. We'll see a great example of that in Brahms' cadenza to Mozart's C minor concerto, by the way. Of like, he finds this one place, and he just stays there for kind of a rational amount of time. It's really pretty glorious. Okay, so have fun. Remember, you can speed up and slow down. Take any tempo or tempi that you like. That's great. That's great.
I had a chord in my head that I wanted to go to, but like.
You had it in your ears?
Yeah, I had it in my ears, but like I couldn't find it on the piano. What do you do in that case?
Yeah.
I feel like that
This is
happens
a
all the
great
time.
question. This is a great question. As somebody who played and taught jazz and classical, to deal with that binary for a long time, one thing that's fascinating in jazz curricula versus classical curricula, at least in this country, is that jazz curricula, the ear training component of jazz curricula is much more hardcore, generally speaking, than it is in the classical realm. So I taught at Berkeley College of Music 1 year, my last year in Boston. And I was fascinated to see, I wasn't teaching those courses, I was teaching classical and jazz piano. And yes, there are classical piano majors at Berkeley, which is sort of, you wouldn't necessarily expect. They're not really classical piano majors, they're film scoring majors. And they wanted to play a lot of repertoire, because the idea is to get their hands on, if you're a film composer, one of the things you want to be able to do well is emulate any style of music that has ever existed. So that if you got the call for scoring an 18th century period film, you don't have to say, well, you know, I just write trance music, so I don't know if that's going to work. You'd say, okay, so I can reference that as needed in this film if it's appropriate for the film and whatnot. So that was why there were actually quite a few classical pianists at Berkeley. But they had 8 semesters of ear training, and it got very sophisticated, going through modes, transcription projects that were timed, and so forth, because jazz is so inherent on, so reliant on being able to hear something and playing it back immediately, and the oral tradition being much more of a serious, central and essential aspect of its history. So a lot of that is just keep working on your ear training and hunt and peck. If you hear that chord when you're practicing, if you hear that chord and you play something, that's not what I meant to play. First thing is, did you play the melodic note correctly and not the rest of the chord correctly? Ask yourself why you weren't able to find it, is basically what I'm saying. And then hunt and peck for that proper harmony. And then go back and forth between those 2 chords. And and say, what's the root progression of these chords? What's the connection between the chords? Are there 2 chords that exist in the same key? Are there 2 chords that don't exist in the same key but have a common tone relationship? So analyze that, transpose it a little bit. So I'm going to play this progression of 2 chords now in a few keys. And this will get better, and I'll be able to find these chords faster with my ears. So that's what I did and what I do, and these things elude me as well.
Yeah, that is so cool. I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think the chord I was meaning to play was an F minor chord, maybe? I don't know.
F minor, so going, and where were you coming from? Because context is everything. So you went to the parallel minor, and then you were going to the subdominant.
Yeah, that's kind of what I had in here.
Yeah.
Just couldn't find that.
Just couldn't find it. So I want you, let's do it again. So that was great. Go for continuity this time, okay? If you get to a chord and you don't know what you want to do, or you're stuck, sustain that harmony, or sustain slow harmonies, and play it like you mean it.
Okay.
That's a really good skill to work on with continuity. Go ahead and don't be afraid to use space. That's a big jazz cliche. You gotta use more space in your solo when you're playing too many notes. But there's almost, if you're convinced of it, if you can make yourself convinced of it, there's almost no such thing as too much space.
Okay.
Maybe there is such a thing as too much space, but it's good to think that there's no such thing as too much space.
Convince yourself.
Yeah. Especially the way you project to an audience. So there are times when I'm soloing where I'm playing very slow harmonies where things are moving very, very slowly, or where I'm exploring one harmony, and I feel like doing it. But there are times where I'm actually not really sure what I want to do next. But I'm trying, at those moments, I'm trying to play as the most musically I possibly can play, the most convincingly I possibly can play. It's okay to stay on a harmony for a long time. Beethoven does this, where he gets into these kinds of trances, sometimes with in quiet music, especially in retransitions to recapitulations, and he's just repeating the same harmony and sometimes voicing it in a rational amount of time, or the opposite, triumphal passages, cadential endings to things. It's like, when is the Fifth Symphony really going to end? Because there's these series of cadences, these fake out endings at the end of the Fifth Symphony, right? So there's nothing wrong with repetition or stasis. Just make it nice and musical, and relax your brain. Tell yourself it's okay, and then move on when you want to move on. It's a good philosophical mindset to have when you're practicing continuity as an improviser. Okay, so go for that, and let's do another one. Okay, good. So that was that.
Tried to get back to the major, but I got kind of stuck.
Oh, that's okay. So what did you need to do to get back to the major? What would be the easiest thing to do to get back to the major?
I guess I could play like instead of F minor. Well, I don't know. That would be weird.
You can play F minor. We were talking about mode mixture before. So F minor to C major, minor 4 going to major 1. You're borrowing the F minor from C minor, from the parallel minor. That's a time-honored cadence.
Don't you want to get to the 5 though, so you can like,
Well, if you're going to be very Mozartian, yeah.
Yeah.
So it just the dominant of the main key is your friend. So you can even often play it out of context, and you'll get lucky and it'll be fine, even if you're far afield, and just get to the dominant 7th chord. Now I want you to try one more thing.
Okay.
All right, this is a circle of fifths exercise. So the idea is to improvise on this or not on this. Doesn't matter so much, but to start at C, and then decide that you're either going to move to G or F. It's nice to go one direction, so let's just decide that you're going to keep moving up. Your root is going to keep moving up in perfect fifths. And you're just going to keep doing it. And maybe you'll get through the whole circle of fifths. So you start in C major, say, right? Then you'll improvise in C major, and then you'll move to G major. You don't have to cadence in G major. You don't need to go 5-1 in G major. You just move to G. You can use, anytime you move to the key, you can possibly add a suspension, right? So if we're going to D next, you don't have to do it all the time, but if it occurs to you, go for it. This is a really great fundamental improvisation exercise to do it clockwise in the circle of fifths and counterclockwise in the circle of fifths where you're going in perfect fourths.
And is my goal to get back around to C, or?
Your goal for the full exercise it is, yeah.
Okay.
But let's just get at least through a few keys. And then if you feel like, well, you've had enough and you're like an E major or something, then just go ahead and make it sound like an ending. But when you're in C major, you're messing around in C major for a while, and then you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to move to G major. You think about that before you do it, and then you do it. And that's the process. And then you're improvising in G major for a little while. Then you're thinking about, okay, I got to prepare to move to D major, and then you do it.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out the sound of the G major.
You just play. You don't have to do a cadence. You just you're just using the notes of the G major scale. You can even start off by playing the scale itself to ground you a little bit. Even simpler than that. So. just on a C major chord, and then you're just on a G major chord, and so forth. Okay, great. That's a good departure point. So you can keep it simpler and do a slow improvisation. It doesn't even have to be on material in this piece or in any particular piece. Especially when you're first doing it, so that the first goal is, can I get through the whole circle of fifths doing this? And then you'll become more and more, you'll be able to build prowess with that level. Great, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Audience is peeled off. So tomorrow it's in convocation, 4:10, and I'm going to delve into the C minor concerto, and that'll be mostly kind of lecture stuff, but there'll be a lot of interesting twists and turns, especially when we see what Brahms, the crazy stuff that Brahms did with his cadenza. So, see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.